Welcome everybody. Welcome both in the room and around the web. I'm Colin Kirk. I'm the Director of Evaluation in UNICEF, and this is a webinar that we're hosting on behalf of UNEG, the UN Evaluation Group. And it's my pleasure to introduce Martina Vojtkova, who's based in the 3IE office in London. Has been there since the very early days of 3IE, so is a real foundation member of 3IE. And she's going to be talking today about evidence gap maps, a new tool which will help us draw together the ever-increasing volume of evidence on particular development topics. And she's going to talk about the particular application of the evidence gap map to a particular case. So Martina, over to you.
Thank you, Colin. And again, thank you so much for allowing me to present. And I know it's a really busy week in New York and for the UN, so I'm glad that people could make some time, and I hope that what I present will be useful. As Colin mentioned, I will be presenting on kind of an evidence gap map tool and its particular application to the productive safety net program. And I will briefly introduce what the evidence gap maps are and what they do, and then kind of walk you through an example of it to make it a bit clearer. Because part of their programming is to try and help end poverty by 2030, something that it looks like is going to also become the first sustainable development goal. And so they wanted to get a better sense of what we already know about what works to help achieve this goal. And maybe where some more kind of strategic research commissioning should be happening. So the idea really was to kind of try and figure out what we should be doing to really help achieve this fairly ambitious goal, knowing that some of the earliest achievements in reducing poverty may have been some of the easier ones, and also being aware of the fact that we're not just trying to reduce extreme poverty, but poverty in all of its forms. So USAID has commissioned an evidence gap map, and I'll briefly describe what evidence gap maps are. So evidence gap maps are thematic collections of evidence in a particular thematic area or sector that map out the existing impact evaluations and systematic reviews in this sector. And I will speak a little bit later to what we understand at 3A under impact evaluations and systematic reviews. The map itself is this structured framework of key interventions in that particular field and key outcomes of interest that these interventions are trying to affect. And the framework of the outcomes is kind of laid out along a causal chain from some intermediate outcomes going to some more final outcomes. The idea is to identify where we have a lot of evidence and where we have strong evidence about what works, but also to identify where there are some evidence gaps. To provide an overview of the quality of this evidence and to provide an easy access to this existing evidence through links to user-friendly summaries on 3A evidence databases. So this is just to give you a brief visual of what I'm talking about, and I will present the full evidence gap map a bit later, but this is just a cutout. You can see in the first column going down are the types of interventions, productive safety net interventions in this case. In the first row are the kind of types of outcomes along the causal chain. And this framework is then populated with evidence, which are these bubbles in the middle. The size of the evidence the size of the bubble reflects the size of the evidence. And the color reflects both the type of evidence and some of the quality. And I just realized that for the people in the room, you can't really see some of the gray bubbles. So you may have to imagine them. And some of the emptier areas where there are no bubbles show some of the gaps in the evidence base. Is there a way to make it a bit less...
Yeah, actually, nicely.
Okay. If I turn it this way, will you guys see? Okay. The idea behind evidence gap maps is twofold. One is to help identify in one quick overview what the evidence is that we have to help inform decision making about policies and programs. And the other one is to help guide research commissioning in terms of both research funding and the doing of research towards those areas where we don't know yet what works or don't have programs evaluated. The evidence gap map of productive safety nets focuses on safety net programs that include either a livelihood or an income generating component, with the idea of helping people sustainably escape poverty. And the key outcomes that the evidence gap map looks at are individual and household level outcomes along the causal chain that are related to reducing poverty and improving general well-being. The types of studies we include are impact evaluations, which 3A defines as studies that use counterfactual analysis to try and understand how much of the outcome that is happening can actually be attributed to the program or the intervention. So what would have happened, comparing it to what would have happened in the absence of the intervention. And systematic reviews of intervention effectiveness, and I don't know how many people are familiar with these. So systematic reviews are like literature reviews, but they're very comprehensive, and they try and overview all of the evidence, regardless of the findings of the evidence, and then very transparently report these. And these are some of the kind of key features of a systematic review. So they cover all published and unpublished literature. They critically appraise this literature, and they try and synthesize it regardless of findings and clearly report in an unbiased way what the findings across these studies are, both what can be generalized but also what is context specific. Now, the evidence gap maps follow a similar approach to trying to identify evidence. So, like systematic reviews, an evidence gap map will search through a large number of studies to try and identify all possible impact evaluations and systematic reviews that can be included. The evidence gap map of productive safety nets, for that one we've screened through almost 14,000 study titles and abstracts, and we ended up including 248 impact evaluations and 24 systematic reviews. It's a bit of a challenge. It always looks like we're losing a lot of relevant evidence, but actually if you look at some of the reasons for exclusion, the search strategy is never quite specific enough, so you end up getting a lot of very unrelated literature that you can very quickly screen out because it's not looking at developing countries, it's not looking at a productive safety net intervention, etc. So this is what the overall evidence gap map looks like, and now I think we can even see the green bubbles in the room on the screen, which is great. And you can see that there is a lot of evidence, but it's kind of not very evenly distributed. So there's some areas that have a lot of evidence, and there's some areas that have little. Now, the evidence gap map tool, which is accessible on the 3A website for free, is an interactive tool. So it allows you to play around with this evidence a little bit. At the bottom, there are these 5 legend bubbles, which you can, what the techies call toggle off. So if you, for example, press the most left one on impact evaluation, it removes all the impact evaluation, so you can then just see the other types of evidence. So these are all the systematic reviews. The green ones are the ones that we judge to be of high confidence in the findings. Orange ones are medium, red ones are low, and blue ones are ongoing systematic reviews still in process. If you hover over a bubble, it gives you a drop-down list of all the impact evaluations in that particular intersection. So, for example, this one shows you all the studies that evaluate the effect of credit and leasing interventions on asset and land accumulation. And these are hyperlinks, so if you click on one of them, it will take you to a brief summary of the main findings of that study on the 3A database, so you can quickly explore the findings of some of these studies. The database also has a little area which tells you where you can find a full report for that study, so if you want to read it fully, you can go there. Some of the other features of the evidence gap maps, it allows you to filter the evidence by region, by country, by study design, and most recently also by population type. It allows you to zoom into certain areas, and it allows you to read the definitions for each of these intervention or outcome categories by clicking on that description in the first column or the first row. So briefly, some of the findings of the evidence gap map, because I think it helps people understand how they can be used for decision making. So the evidence gap map of productive safety nets found a very large number of impact evaluations and a good number of systematic reviews, so 250. But as you can see, according to this graph, they're not evenly distributed. So the majority of the evidence is focusing on credit and leasing and savings interventions, so microfinance, and multi-component interventions, but even a good proportion of these is still microfinance. They just don't break it down into what is the kind of active ingredient or what is the specific product that the intervention is providing. Some of the gaps are up here. These are cash transfers. Now, I realize there's a huge literature on cash transfers, but we restricted it only to cash transfer programs that have an additional income or livelihood component, so some form of training or some sort of grant to help you start a business, or something that actually can help you make use of that additional money, not just the typical cash transfer where you're just given cash as a kind of grant. Another area, interestingly, under microfinance, microinsurance is quite under-researched, and then we found absolutely no evidence on interventions that are trying to connect people to markets with some of the more kind of business-oriented interventions. In terms of outcomes, a very great proportion of the studies report some outcomes on either income, consumption and savings, employment, asset and land acquisition, and some intermediate outcomes such as access to the intervention or take-up of the intervention. But very surprisingly, even though there is a huge number of studies looking at income and consumption, the very few of those studies then actually go and measure whether people escaped poverty, which is quite surprising because a lot of these programs are intended to help people sustainably escape poverty. Another area was kind of not very well evaluated is people's ability to manage risk or cope, which again is a key outcome for sustainable escaping of poverty. And then income inequality is very rarely explored, and as seems to be the case for pretty much every field I've looked at so far, very little information on cost and cost effectiveness. But the evidence gap map also shows you that there are some very specific areas where there are gaps. So these are particularly interventions relating to helping to improve business knowledge or business practices or helping people start enterprises, again for adaptive capacity or risk management, income poverty, food security, and that's kind of it, food security. In terms of the systematic review literature, it's sort of 50-50. Just about more than half of the systematic reviews that we included we considered to be of either high or medium confidence in the findings, and this is based on both how well the reviews report what they've done, but also whether what they have done was appropriately done, whether they critically appraised all the included studies before they summarized them, etc. And again, if you look at the distribution of the systematic review evidence, it gives you a very different picture. A lot of it, again, is just focusing on credit or kind of microinsurance services and some of these group formation and multi-component interventions. So that's not very encouraging. However, if you do add the ongoing systematic reviews, you can see that it's slowly starting to fill up. So those are the ones to watch if you're interested in some of the other areas. And I will not spend too much time on the findings, but this is just to give you a bit of a flavor of the findings you can get from some of these high-confidence systematic reviews. So, for example, there's a very good quality systematic review looking at the effects of microcredit on women's control over household spending as a measure of women's empowerment. And the review finds that, on average, there is no consistent evidence to suggest that this improves women's household domestic empowerment. However, the review does find some mediating factors that do enable women to achieve this, including, if the size of the transfer is larger, if the women have fewer children, if they are younger, and if their husbands are a little bit more open to the women owning. So if it's already kind of on the way to the women having more empowerment, that can really be encouraging. Some of the most interesting findings for me from the evidence gap map was the status of the evidence on the poor. So of these almost 250 impact evaluations and 24 systematic reviews, just above a half actually tell you that they're evaluating the poor. The others, you have no idea whether the people they're evaluating are defined in any way as being poor. Of these studies, only under a quarter actually do then analysis by poverty status. So that's 1/8 of the entire evidence base that bothers to do analysis by poverty status. When you look at the types of categories of poverty that these studies report, the majority of the studies that tell you that they're evaluating effects on the poor will just tell you that. That's the end of it. They don't define it. They don't tell you what they mean by the poor. Very few of them actually give you specific definitions, such as, we evaluated the poor based on a national poverty line, or based on calorific content or food security, or a multiple deprivation index, or $1.25, or whatever it is. So if you actually look at the evidence on extreme poor defined as $1.25, this is what the map looks like. So overall, there is a huge amount of evidence on productive safety net programs, but there's a considerable evidence gap on the effect on the poor. There's key gaps on whether these programs actually help people escape poverty, and whether they help them become more able to manage risks and adapt to crises. There's very little evidence on cost effectiveness. And the reporting on who is the targeted or evaluated population is very limited, and there's a great variation of poverty definitions used, which makes it difficult for both synthesizing this evidence, but also for being able to apply it in practice. And there's still quite a lack of high and medium confidence systematic reviews in some areas where there is impact evaluation evidence. In terms of implications for policy and research, there is the large volume of evidence which can be useful. I actually do think that if you end up doing a bit more work and asking the authors and looking at the program information, you might be able to elicit some of this information about who was targeted and who was evaluated. So I think it's not all doom and gloom. And there are some very useful findings, especially from the systematic reviews, high and medium confidence, that I think are definitely worth exploring. But I do think that better reporting in studies would improve our ability to use this evidence without having to go through this extra effort to collect this additional information to help target these programs and to help us synthesize the global evidence better. And then just like a brief conclusion about evidence gap maps in general, I mean, we hope that they can be useful for general decision making and for the Sustainable Development Goals, because they are trying to present all the existing evidence in a field at a glance on one page. They should help quickly identify high-quality evidence, particularly that of systematic reviews, suitable for informing policy. They are trying to provide access to summaries of this research, which can be quickly accessed, and they can highlight some of the evidence gap maps that are still out there that can both help guide research, but also help guide policy, in that you can just say, well, we don't know, so what are we going to do, and should we try and evaluate it as we go along? So we hope it can be a useful tool for decision making. At the same time, I would like to point out some caveats. It is a tool. It's not a ready-made answer. You can't stop critically thinking when you use it. You need to really work with the material to arrive at your own conclusions about what is best in which given context and for which given population. So it helps you access this evidence, but you still need to be the decision maker. It does not currently include studies that look at other highly relevant questions, such as what are some of the predictive factors for people, for example, falling into poverty or staying in poverty, some information on implementation, barriers and facilitators to effectiveness. This is not because we don't think these are important. It's just that once you start adding everything to the same evidence gap map, it starts becoming less useful as a tool. And so there's nothing preventing evidence gap maps from doing that in the future, but currently we focus on evidence on what works. And then also they don't critically appraise impact evaluations, and they do not provide in-depth synthesis of findings. So if there's a field that has 54 impact evaluations in a particular cell, we don't go as far as actually critically appraising and synthesizing these, because this is really the realm where systematic reviews work, and systematic reviews really do it rigorously and thoroughly, and this is meant to be a much quicker tool of mapping what we know. So they're not trying to replace a full systematic review with rigorous critical appraisal and synthesis of the evidence. And finally, 3A has some completed and ongoing evidence gap maps. So this is a list of both types. The ones that are completed are already on the 3A website. This is the link, but they're fairly easy to find if you just type it into Google. And we are really hoping to be able to develop evidence gap maps to match each of the Sustainable Development Goals to really help decision making for the next 15 years going forward. And that's it.
Great, Martina, thank you very much. Terrific. Lots to think about there, and clearly a very powerful tool used in the right way. So let me open it up for comments and questions. First of all, in the room, since we're a small group in the room, any comments or questions from colleagues around the table? Go ahead.
I have two. Is there a way to also be able to indicate like the direction of the finding in the sense of like makes lives better or doesn't make lives better, in the sense to be able to also show where there's consistency in responses?
Mm-hmm.
And then my second question was how lengthy of an exercise is
okay.
Let me come because I'm related. My question is related to the length of the exercise. I'd like to know like how much will it cost? How do we undertake it? And how much manpower or people power you put into to deliver this?
Yeah. So let me answer the first question first. So we've started doing sort of two types of evidence gap maps. One was evidence gap map that looks just at systematic reviews, because a systematic review already does this. It collects all the evidence. So say you're looking at microfinance, a systematic review will systematically search the literature, find all the impact evaluations of microfinance, critically appraise it, and do a synthesis, either statistical or narrative, which will give you exactly that. It will give you a sense of how many of them were positive, how many of them were negative. It will take into account different sample sizes, so the ones that have small sample sizes will be given less weight than the ones that are very precisely estimated, and will give you both an overall idea about how effective that program is globally, but we might also be able to do some of this additional analysis of does it work better in one place or another, or for some types of populations, etc. Now, a systematic review, if done well, can take between, depending on how broad it is, a year to 2 years. And we decided not to indicate direction of effect in the evidence gap maps, because it's very easy to then just do vote counting and say, well, 17 out of 20 studies show some positive effect, therefore it must be positive. And you're losing out a lot of this kind of information about, is it, how many of these studies do you actually trust? Right. The quality of the precision of the estimate, etc. That was the reason why we chose not to do it for the impact evaluations, but that's also the reason why we include systematic reviews, because we know they're out there, and we don't think that they're as useful yet as they could be in people understanding what they are and what they give you, and being able to give you this global picture of the evidence base where somebody else has done the work for you already. In terms of the length of exercise, again, it does depend a lot on, do you want to include just systematic reviews or systematic reviews and impact evaluations? And it is to an extent dependent on how broad is your framework, and to an extent something that is not under your control, which is how much literature is out there. This is by far one of the biggest evidence gap maps we have done. I didn't expect to encounter about 250 impact evaluations, and it took us about 3 months to produce a first draft, and there were two to three people working on it full time for that period. So if you have the right people on the team who are experienced with systematic searching, who can help you develop a search strategy quickly, and someone who can train people in kind of systematic screening for inclusion and exclusion and systematic data extraction, it doesn't have to be a lengthy exercise. Normally we say between 2 to 3 up to 6 months, depending on whether you care about having double screening, so having 2 people decide at full text whether that study should be included, depending on whether you care about double data extraction, so to make sure that things have been categorized consistently, and again, depending on whether, for us, we're also producing these summaries, so that's an additional amount of time that you wouldn't necessarily have to do. You can just directly link it to the original study, which will have an abstract, and we critically praise the systematic reviews, which again might add time and you don't have to do so. It's variable, and I think you can fit it a bit to your time and resources in an extent, but there's always that moment of surprise when you end up with 200 impact evaluations, and it'll just take as much time as that takes to code.
Great. We've got somebody online, so let's switch over to our colleagues online. And Paul Knox-Clark from ALNAP, I think you have a question. Can you unmute your mic and pose the question, Paul?
Yes, thank you, Colin. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, thanks.
Great, and thanks. That was a really interesting presentation. Thanks, UNEG, for putting it on. The question that I had, the interest I had here was around the quality criteria that you mentioned. The high quality, medium quality, low quality, because I assume that the criteria for quality is really about the internal validity of the data, and that as we're looking at sort of RCTs and experimental approaches and systematic reviews, they would be high quality to the degree that they're strong on internal validity. But for policy purposes, for creation of global policy, actually it's the external validity that matters as much. So the gap map, I'm wondering about how I'm not sure I've quite formulated this, but if you're using a gap map to sort of say, we have a lot of evidence to show that this kind of thing works or doesn't work for this kind of impact, can you actually say that on the basis of the inputs? Because what the inputs are probably, the high quality inputs are saying, we have a lot of evidence to show that in this context, this particular input led to this particular impact. But does that really tell you anything for policy development? Sorry, I don't know if that was clear.
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, I think the key point is, are these studies all very context specific? And if so, isn't it dangerous to generalize? I slightly dramatized your question there. Martina?
Yeah, so I completely agree. I think sort of the generalizability or external validity of systematic review findings is highly relevant. I think at 3A, the way we think about it is, if you can't even trust the findings from an internal validity point of view, then trying to think about, does it apply globally is kind of less relevant, because if I have a systematic review where I feel like the search hasn't been comprehensive and it includes a broad range of evidence, but the review hasn't made the effort to critically appraise it to try and identify which ones of the included studies you should trust more and less, and then maybe run an analysis to see whether including just the high quality evidence versus including all of it, does it change the findings? If I don't have a systematic review like that, I wouldn't really want to use it for any kind of decision making with much confidence. I would really want to have some red flags going in my head saying, well, I don't know how unbiased this overall finding is from systematic review. Once you have it, there is definitely still a question of, well, where does this evidence come from? If the majority of it comes from Latin America, but you're trying to see does it apply in Africa, then even a high confidence systematic review won't be able to tell you as much. Then you have to kind of assess the context where it came from and assess the context where you're trying to apply it and think, well, is it transferable? Unfortunately, there isn't actually any piece of research that can kind of confidently tell you that something will translate across context or to a different context. But a good quality systematic review will tell you where the evidence comes from, which context, which populations, to help you make that assessment. So the aim of the evidence gap map is to show you which of these systematic reviews you can trust for decision making, but then you as a user need to go and read the systematic review and find out where the evidence comes from to see whether it is genuinely global or it is restricted to a particular region. And unfortunately, systematic reviews can't do much about it, because if all the impact evaluations are from a region, then the systematic review can only report what has been evaluated.
Great. Okay.
Thank you. That's really. I just wonder if there is the opportunity as you go forward with this to identify within the bubbles high internal, high external validity, so that one knows that area is really covered and that is policy heavy, whereas this one, yes, we've got quite a lot, but what we've got is not necessarily going to be very useful. I wonder if there's the opportunity to do something like that. But thank you very much. That clarifies greatly.
That's a very nice suggestion. I will definitely add it to the suggestion of where we could take this forward. Thank you.
Great. Do you want to just introduce yourself first?
My name is Claudia Barwan. I work for IOS, Office of Internal Oversight Services, the evaluation right here in the May. My question was, after you did this big effort with a lot of people working on it, you even mentioned that there were a few surprises of areas that are not populated, where there really is not much known. Is 3IE doing or advocating actively to kind of show what came out of it? In the research community, we have a lot from this area, but surprisingly, or not surprisingly, I don't know, not much on this area. So how have you taken forward what you found?
So, I mean, I guess 3IE's approach so far has been a little bit varied. So this particular evidence gap map was kind of commissioned for USAID. So we've done a lot of work with USAID on presenting the findings. We had a webinar. There's a report that goes with it. We've been quite in close contact with them. But so far there hasn't been a push to, for example, create a window focusing on some of these areas. Some of the other evidence gap maps, and I know Colin has been involved in one on immunization, were specifically developed to help inform research commissioning in that field. So it was done before we had a window of grants for impact evaluations, and it fed into understanding what proposals are valuable and what proposals might be emerging in that window. So I guess there wasn't like a systematic, we don't have a system in it yet in terms of, okay, now we have it, what does 3IE do about it? It's been kind of responsive to where the evidence gap came from, and partially kind of an interest in funding some of these areas. But I think over time, hopefully there will be potential to take it further in that direction as well.
And your concluding slide was making the connection with the SDGs, of course, so that, to know what works, we need to have a good evidence base, against the various SDGs. So there's going to be a lot of discussion about indicators and so on and so forth. What we need is a lot of discussion about what we know and what we don't know, not just about indicators. Anyone else online?
Yeah, actually, Nicola Baldwin would like to ask a question, and I will read her question here. The 3IE evidence gap maps I have seen so far are usually a synthesis of interventions, systematic reviews of interventions, and impact evaluations. Is it possible to do a gap map to find out what the gaps in a body of research are in general, For example, we want to know the state of the evidence on the structural determinants of adolescent well-being. We would like to know where there is a lot of research, where there are gaps in knowledge and the quality of this research, so that we know where to do new research. Can a gap map be used for this and how?
Yes, so the evidence gap map methodology is a method, and there's a methods paper. I didn't provide a link, but there's a World Bank working paper that outlines the methods, and I do think that the methods are adaptable. 3A's main kind of remit is to focus on effectiveness, which is why we started doing evidence gap maps of effectiveness. But there's no reason why you couldn't shift the framework to look at, instead of outcome categories, to look at factors, barriers and facilitators, or determinants of something happening. I think that the difficult part becomes figuring out the framework. And the framework for the evidence gap maps is a bit of a deductive and inductive process. So for most of our evidence gap maps, you consult policy documents, you try and consult some policymakers in the field, and you're aware of some evidence already. So you put together a framework, then you collect your evidence, and as you're going through the searching and screening, you realize, oh, there's a whole category of interventions we didn't think about because it wasn't on anybody's radar, but there are interventions that fit into this sector and that evaluate these outcomes, for example. So you might then add something to the framework to keep it comprehensive. For something like determinants of well-being or determinants of a problem arising or existing, or barriers and facilitators, it might have to be a more inductive process of developing that framework. Unless you're quite aware of what the kind of key categories might be, you might have to go through the framework a few times to arrive at something that is comprehensive and detailed enough, but not too detailed to make the map work. But there's no reason why the same methods couldn't be applied to such a purpose.
Great. Looking around the room, any more questions or comments? And online, have we got any more questions or comments online? Not yet. Okay, well, I think we can wrap up. I think that's been a very interesting introduction to the tool, and as you say, it could be developed further. There are different ways in which it could be developed. Important to apply it to different situations and see how it works in different sectors and in regard to different areas of development and so on. I think what it reminds us, many of us who are involved in evaluations, we get so absorbed in our particular little evaluation, we forget there's this huge world of knowledge out there that we're not drawing on adequately. So it's a good reminder, and I think particularly as we go into the SDG era, to think about more systematically, to think about what knowledge is available and indeed where there are gaps and where there are weaknesses in what we know and what we don't know. So big thank you, Martina. Thanks for coming in today, and we look forward to seeing more. Looks like we have another question online, so let's hear that one.
Nicola, do you want to actually ask a question yourself? You said you want to ask one more question.
Yeah, just unmute yourself, Nicola. Just ask direct.
Okay, sorry to be jumping in. I know you want to wrap up, but I'm really actually interested in this area, so that's why. And Martina, I was just wondering if you could briefly tell me what the advantage would be over doing an evidence gap map as opposed to a rapid evidence assessment. Given the issue I outlined earlier of wanting to kind of understand what the level and quality of research is in a particular area, what do you see kind of the advantages of the gap map as opposed to something like a rapid evidence assessment? Thank you.
So I think in a way they have a slightly different purpose. For me, an evidence gap map looks at a field more broadly. Whereas to actually make a rapid evidence assessment happen, you need to have a very narrow research question looking at very specific outcomes to be able to do a rapid evidence assessment in, say, 3 months. So one way of thinking about the evidence gap maps is like the first stage towards rapid evidence assessments, because you could do an evidence gap map and then say, oh, here's a pile of impact evaluations for which there isn't a systematic review. We've done a lot of the searching already. Let's carry just this one area forward into a rapid evidence assessment, assess the quality of the studies, do a synthesis, done. So they're not mutually exclusive. They just have a very different purpose. The evidence gap map is mapping the evidence. A rapid evidence assessment is asking a very specific question and then synthesizing the evidence to find the answer to it.
Nicola, do you want to come back in?
No, that's great. Thank you. That was really helpful. Thanks a lot.
Great. So we've recorded this webinar, so there's lots to think about, lots to go into in depth. The website details have been provided. There's a presentation for those of you who don't have it. We'll send it around, put it on the UNEG website so everyone has access to it. There's lots of material on the 3IE website on this, further information about the tool and indeed a tool for you. So it's freely available to experiment with. So lots of information out there to work with, to be going on. But let me stop here and thank Martina once again for coming in today and for giving us this very interesting presentation. Thank you very much, Martina.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
There we go.